Welcome to our second Schemel Forum luncheon of the semester. And before we begin today's program, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Munley Law for the generous sponsorship and to our engaged community of members and attendees. You all help to continue make these conversations possible. So thank you to each of you. Your support sustains the Schemel Forum's mission of bringing thoughtful dialogue, diverse perspectives, and global understanding to our campus and to our beautiful city as well, our rainy, beautiful city. We have several wonderful programs ahead this fall and hope to see you at each of them. So I'm just gonna run through them real quick. On Friday, November 7th, we'll have Mateusz Sakowicz, Consul General of the Republic of Poland, for a World Affairs luncheon. On Thursday, November 13th, in collaboration with the Friends of the Weinberg Memorial Library, Professor Michael Neese will present From Manuscript to Print, The Journey of Medieval Books. This program celebrates the library's newest treasure, a circa 1470 first edition, printed by Ulrich Zell. And this lecture will also have an exhibit alongside it and a reception following it. Then on Thursday, November 20th, we'll be joined by Matthew Duss, Executive Director for the Center for International Policy and former Carnegie Endowment visiting scholar. At this luncheon, he will talk about America is ready for a pro-peace foreign policy, but is Washington? And finally, looking ahead to the new year, we have the J. Nathan Ph.D. Visiting Scholar Lecture Series, which will be held on Thursday, January 15th, 2026. Mark your calendars, where we will be welcoming Ambassador of Finland, Leena-Kaisa Mikkola, for an evening, which will include a lecture from the ambassador. I believe she'll be bringing a cultural diplomat with her as well. We will also have an authentic Finnish cultural performance, and of course we'll have a reception following that as well. I hope to see all of you at those events, and please spread the word and bring your friends as well, friends and family. Okay, sorry for the long introduction to what's ahead. Now let's talk about what's immediately ahead. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Josef Wegner. He has many titles. So he's Professor of Egyptian Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, Chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, and Curator of the Egyptian section at the Penn Museum. Many of you will remember Dr. Wegner from his engaging presentation last year when he explored the history of Penn's pioneering work in Egypt and the formation of the museum's extraordinary collection of over 50,000 artifacts. Today, he returns to share recent discoveries from the Penn Museum's ongoing excavations at Abydos, one of Egypt's most important royal burial grounds. His team has uncovered a remarkable necropolis known as Anubis Mountain, where at least 13 kings who ruled between 1850 and 1650 BCE were interred, including previously unknown pharaohs such as King Seneb-Kay. Did I do that right? Pretty good, close enough, which was discovered in 2014, and a mysterious ruler whose tomb was unearthed just recently in January of 2025. So these findings expand our understanding of ancient Egyptian society and remind us of humanity's enduring effort to make meaning through what we create and through what we leave behind. So please join me in welcoming back Dr. Josef Wegner as he guides us through the latest chapter in Penn's century-long story of discovery in Egypt.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, George, for your kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back here. My wife, Jennifer, who's here, and I drove up, if you remember, last year. It was the end of November. The weather was almost exactly like this on the drive from Philadelphia. Raining the whole way, and raining when we left, but then it started snowing on the way home. So we're hoping at least that it won't be snowing on the drive back. But otherwise, the view from these windows looks almost identical to what I remember from last year. So it's great to be back. As George mentioned, I'm picking up in a way from where I left off last year. My plan last year was to give you a bit of an overview of the very deep history that the Penn Museum in Philadelphia has in the investigation and kind of reconstruction of ancient Egypt, its history, its culture, religion, the various phases of Egyptian history. And I talked a fair bit about that. The final stage of my lecture was going to look at new discoveries, recent work, and that's where I ran out of time. So this next installment is going to give you a little bit of a sense of what we do in Egypt, some of the recent work that we've been doing. So some of it will be very recent work. I just came back from Egypt on Sunday, and I'm going back on Sunday. So a brief visit back to the States. But we're actively working there, and I'll talk about some of the discoveries that we've made over the last 10 plus years, and interesting questions about this place. The site that I'm going to be talking about today is a particularly important archaeological site in Egypt called Abydos. I'll talk a little bit about the significance of that particular site. And let me just find that. There we go. So if you remember, this was my title last year. We had delved into work that started in the 1800s that assembled the magnificent collection, as George mentioned, of over 50,000 pieces in Philadelphia. I talked a little bit about our really major reinstallation project, which is a multi-million dollar project, reinstalling the entire Egyptian wing of the Penn Museum, which, just to remind you, it's the third largest collection in the United States after the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The Penn Museum has the third largest collection of Egyptian archaeological material. It's a really magnificent collection with a lot of large pieces, architectural fragments, and elements of buildings like this that you see here, parts of a pharaoh's palace from the New Kingdom that we're installing, and just a whole range of objects from different periods. This has involved redesigning, really, and reconstructing the wing that was built a century ago. We've invested a lot of money in kind of the infrastructure that's going to support these galleries, and I'm not going to delve into it for the interest of time, but we have two major floors with 8 different galleries. And the first stage of this, which is the lower floor, there are 4 galleries on the lower hall that include the funerary arts. Jennifer, my wife, is the lead curator of that display. And that, fortunately, is now in the process of installation. And one of the things that's going in as we speak is this magnificent tomb chapel. It's called the Tomb Chapel of Khafre, or Khafre. Khafre was a high official during the time of the pyramids. Lived about 2400 BC during what we call Dynasty 5. And we have this decorated chapel. You can see the painted imagery is quite well preserved in it. For many, many years, it was on display in the lower hall. People could enter into it, and there you can see an old photo, I think maybe from the 1950s, of the tomb chapel. And then they closed it because kids would be going in there, and they started writing their names in pencil on the walls, and they just said, okay, we'll close it. And then we had it as part of a traveling exhibit. It was taken apart, and it actually hasn't been on display since, I think, the late 1980s. Is that right? 87? 97. Okay, yeah, we had a traveling exhibit in 97. So yeah, it was taken apart, and that is the anchor piece, really, for the main lower hall. And so just this last week or two, they've started installing that. There you see some of the masonry blocks going in. So around this are going to be the major displays of the funerary arts and funerary religion. So just a couple slides of that. So you'll be able to walk into this chapel to see the painted decoration. We've designed it so that it's been pulled apart to make it accessible, and now it's going to be behind glass, so school kids can't do what they do. We've tried to just avoid that happening. So Jen is very busy with that ongoing process. One of the sites that is part of these collections at the Penn Museum, among many, many sites, is this place called Abydos that I'm going to talk about today. Abydos has a long history of interest and investigation as part of the Penn Museum's activities in Egypt. In fact, going back to the very beginnings, the inception of the building of the collection in the 1880s, we began to get material coming from this site called Abydos. And there you see it, just the location of it. I don't need to point it out. The red arrow there on the map on the right shows its location. It's about 300 miles south of modern Cairo, roughly like a 6 or 8 hour drive, depending on how fast you make it south. South of Cairo. Since Abydos was such an interesting site, the museum had actually assembled a fairly significant collection of material from Abydos going back into the 1800s. In the 1960s, my former advisor at Penn, David O'Connor, decided, well, why don't we start doing work at Abydos? This is a major site that has not actually seen kind of systematic scientific archaeological excavation for a long period of time. And he applied for parts of the site of Abydos. He was given permission for them. And in the late 1960s, he started what became known for a long period of time as the Pennsylvania-Yale expedition to Abydos. And that's sort of morphed over the years. Nowadays, we just call it the Pennsylvania Excavations at Abydos. And over many decades, we've had a kind of an evolving program of excavation and investigation of Abydos. The site is a huge one. It stretches over several square miles. I'll look at some of the pieces or elements of it in just a second. The slide on the upper left-hand side gives you a sense of the place. It's all in the desert. It's on the edge of what we call the low desert, between the Nile floodplain, the cultivation of the alluvial plain of the Nile Valley. Between the edge of the cultivation and the high desert cliffs is this sort of undulating sandy landscape that we call the low desert. And this is a place where the Egyptians loved to build sort of enduring monuments, temples that were intended to worship gods for long periods of time, tombs and tomb chapels. And over thousands of years, they developed these really extensive cemeteries and cult facilities at Abydos. So, going back to the 1960s, we have this wonderful dig house, just a couple of views of it, that has kind of grown over the years. The original core of it was built by David O'Connor in 1966 and 67. That's the part that's in the slide on the right-hand side. You can see the beautiful sort of domed rooms there. These are perfectly kind of designed rooms for the desert climate of Egypt. They're made out of mud brick or adobe, essentially. They're wonderful in the summertime because they keep relatively cool. And the domes the heat tends to rise up into the dome, keeping the lower part of the room cool. In the winter time, they tend to also retain the warmth. Just the mud brick construction and the domes are quite nice. I like to joke with my wife Jan. I call it natural air conditioning. I've often told her, and well, when you go into these rooms in the summertime, you just need to close the door and keep it closed during the heat of the day. The heat will rise up into the dome and it'll stay cool. She doesn't believe me that this is true. When it gets up above 110 degrees, as it often does, you definitely feel the heat. But anyway, this is a kind of a traditional building technique, and our dig house makes use of it. So we've been using this house for a long period of time. My own kind of work and kind of scientific career at Abydos started as a graduate student back in the 1990s. I fondly remember my early experiences at Abydos, going to this place. In the early and mid 1990s, Abydos was very, very remote. Again, I said an 8-hour roughly trip south of Cairo. We would take the train, usually from Cairo, get off at the local station stop called Baliana, where the train didn't actually stop at the station. It just slowed down, and you would have to throw all your bags off. So as the team was getting off and the train was beginning to speed up, all of our bags would be just kind of dotting the platform, and then we'd gather them up and make the journey to the dig house after that. These days, we usually fly or drive. Also, in those days, it was incredibly remote. There was no electricity. The local villages actually were not electrified. The house had no electricity, no plumbing. We got our news from BBC World Service on shortwave radio, or occasional trips to Luxor. We would buy newspapers or Time magazine. So we had letters that came by donkey over the dunes to the house. Nowadays, of course, it's all wired in. We have Wi-Fi at the house. Everyone's on their phones. All of the Egyptians have cell phones, and they all have iPhones and whatever. So things have changed in a quite short period of time. I also do remember But before the lights, the electricity and lights were installed, the sky was just beautiful at night. There was no sort of ambient kind of light from the villages, and the sky was just crystal clear and perfect. Nowadays, there's so much light around that it's hard to see it quite as well. Anyway, so we have this long history of the use of this beautiful house. A little bit, just saw that Expedition magazine, which is our research magazine of the Penn Museum. We've had a couple issues of it devoted to work at Abydos. That particular one there from 2014 has a piece on the field house and kind of the history of it, as well as some of the work at that point. You can find this online at the Penn Museum's website if you're interested. All right, so what is Abydos? Abydos is this incredibly ancient center that has a deep history and even a prehistory going back to the very origins of Egyptian civilization. It goes back actually roughly 2,000 years before the age of the pharaohs, before the beginning of history, when it became kind of a local center of burial, of what we think of as probably powerful kind of local chiefs or rulers. As you move forward to the date of about 3000 BC, which is roughly the period of the foundation or establishment of the Kingdom of Egypt, what we call the pharaonic period, where Egypt is unified as a single kind of nation state, Abydos emerges as a really important place. And for some reason, the founding pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of the first dynasty who unified the country, this is what the Egyptians called the Sema Tawi in Egyptian, which means the binding together of the two lands. If you look at the map there on the upper left, and many of you are probably familiar with this, Egypt is a country that's composed of two different kind of distinctive geographical regions. There's what's called the Delta, which is Lower Egypt or Northern Egypt, that verges on the Mediterranean Sea. And then there's the ribbon of the Valley of Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt. So the Nile Valley to the south of the Delta, this is Upper Egypt. The Delta of the north is Lower Egypt. And right around 3000 BC, these two regions were pulled together, unified under the political authority of a single ruler. And they established a capital city at a place called Memphis. Memphis is very close to where modern Cairo is today, right at the place where the Valley of the South and the Delta joined together. Even though that was happening, Abydos was a place that had this incredible kind of draw or kind of memory for the Egyptians. It seems to have been kind of an ancestral burial ground for these founding kings. And so around 3000 BC, out in this low desert landscape, there's this part of Abydos. Today it's called El Gab. In Arabic, that means the mother of pots. It's called the mother of pots because if you walk over the landscape there are literally millions and millions of broken pots just littering the landscape. And this is the result of pilgrims that in later times came to this place and they made offerings on the site of the tombs of the first pharaohs. El Gab is the royal necropolis where Egypt's founding kings were buried. So all of the kings of the first dynasty from about 3000 BC to roughly 2800 BC, as well as some of the kings of the second dynasty, were buried at Abydos. And what this then did is it cemented Abydos in the Egyptian kind of mind and psyche as this kind of ancient symbolic place linked with kingship, with political power, with the origins of their nation. And within a couple centuries of the actual kings being buried at this site today called El Gab, they had transformed El Gab into a religious site that was connected with a particular god called Osiris. Osiris is the archetypal king, visualized as a mummy. He is the deceased pharaoh who's been mummified and reborn as the ruler of the netherworld or the next life. And the Egyptians believed that Osiris himself was buried in this necropolis of the first pharaohs. And so then essentially what happened is over thousands of years, this place became a center of pilgrimage, a place for kings to come and build temples dedicated to Osiris and different gods. There's some really kind of magnificent temples. This big one here in the middle of the map you can see there, the Temple of Seti I is one of the most beautiful temples you could visit in Egypt. The painted decoration is magnificent. It dates to the New Kingdom of Egypt, about 1200 BC. Seti I was the father of the famous Ramses II or Ramses the Great. And there's many other temples, things that aren't on this map here, but it grew up over thousands of years. And you've got kings and commoners coming, building tombs and chapels and temples. And so this huge desert landscape kind of just grows over time, and many pieces are added to it. The part that I'm going to talk about today, though, a little bit south of the necropolis of the first pharaohs and the symbolic tomb of Osiris out here, is this quite interesting part of Abydos that back when I was a graduate student, I got to be interested in. I talked to my advisor, David O'Connor, who had been working in a different part of Abydos, and I said, what about starting up work at South Abydos, in this area that's connected with a king called Senwosret or Sesostris III, where we knew from work about a century ago by a number of British excavators who did initial forays of investigation into this area, that there was a monstrous tomb up at the base of the cliffs here that was connected with a temple. And they had spent a very brief period of time looking at this. They didn't really continue excavations, and so it seemed to be a place that had a lot of potential for renewed excavations. So just to go back very briefly here, there again, Osiris in his form as the god of the netherworld. The Egyptians identified actually a specific tomb in the royal necropolis as the tomb of Osiris. And this is the reason it became the mother of pots, is for thousands of years. There were pilgrimages and religious ceremonies that venerated Osiris in this location. And just some of the things there that are quite interesting. That tomb that you see is the one they, for some reason, cottoned onto as the tomb of Osiris himself. It's actually the tomb of a king called Jer, who was a king of the early first dynasty. But this one, for some reason, we're not quite sure, was the tomb of Osiris to them. Before that, though, Abydos is famous for many other things. The tomb that you see there on the lower left-hand side is a very well-known one in Egyptology. This is the tomb of a king called Scorpion, King Scorpion I, who reigned roughly 3300 BC in what we call the pre-dynastic period. In his tomb are the earliest dated examples of hieroglyphs. You see those little tags there. These are small ivory labels with perforated holes and short text in hieroglyphs. This is the earliest dated use of writing, hieroglyphic writing in Egypt, and it is part of the tombs at this necropolis of El Gab. And of course, we have many objects in our collection that come from excavations by other people that have worked at parts of Abydos, like El Gab, and this will be on display in our new galleries. Some of the material from the necropolis of the first pharaohs. There's a funerary stela of a king called Ka'a, who was the last king of the first dynasty around 2800 BC, and a very famous king there, the alabaster vase, a king called Narmer. Narmer is often thought to be the signature unifying king who brought Egypt to the final state of territorial unification right around 3000 BC. Anyway, so moving back to pick up my work on this other part of Abydos, a little bit to the south of the necropolis of the first pharaohs. What I've been working on for a long period of time, actually started this as my Ph.D. work back in the 1990s, and the place has turned out to be of such interest that I'm still working there a couple decades later. Sometimes I try not to think about how much time I've devoted to the site. is this place that in the last couple decades we've really come to appreciate in its own right as a sort of equivalent to the necropolis of the first pharaohs, another kind of installment, another stage of pharaohs, kings who came to Abydos, who chose this as a place where they wanted to build their tombs. Because probably they were interested in linking themselves with Osiris in death. Osiris was this incredibly potent deity. He's the reigning god of the netherworld. Every king, when he dies, becomes sort of a form of Osiris. The king follows in sort of the model of Osiris, being mummified and reborn and becoming the ruler of the netherworld. So that for them, I think, was very significant. And we have a number of kings that we now know came in later times. They added their tombs at this place that has now been identified as the Mountain of Anubis. It's a very nice, colorful name. It makes reference to another god that's very important in ancient Egypt, the jackal god, Anubis. Anubis was a jackal canine deity who was the protector of the necropolis, more specifically for royalty. He was the guardian of the royal tomb. And at South Abydos, there's this kind of natural peak in the cliffs, the kind of the curvature of the cliffs that you see there in the photograph, where when you stand at the base of it, you receive this kind of overwhelming impression of a very kind of pleasing, kind of natural, harmonious, pyramid-like peak in the landscape. It's not actually a freestanding mountain. It's just part of the natural curve of the cliffs. But at a certain place, it looks like there's this kind of pyramidal peak. And the Egyptians identified this for some reason as what they called the Ju Anpu, the Mountain of Anubis. We know that because we found hundreds and hundreds of impressions, like you see there in the middle, that have the hieroglyphs that you see there on the right. This is what's called the necropolis seal that was used in official functions of the construction and the installation and equipping of the royal tombs there. It's a stamp seal that has the name, the Mountain of Anubis. So that's how we know about the place. And why did it become significant? Long after the first pharaohs that I talked about, who kind of established or anchored Abydos as this very significant religious center for the Egyptians, there was a king who came along at the height of what's called the Middle Kingdom. I won't go into the details of it. Just suffice it to say that the Middle Kingdom is the single greatest period of Egyptian history. It was the height of Egyptian culture and civilization, and my wife is making faces at me. So she doesn't believe that the Middle Kingdom should be identified in that way. For those of us who work on the Middle Kingdom was the greatest period. It was, for the Egyptians, they often looked to the Middle Kingdom as like, the ideal kind of phase of their culture. It was a period of kind of high literature. There are many, many well-known literary texts that were composed that were remembered for thousands of years and copied. It was the time of what's called Middle Egyptian. Very easy to remember. The Middle Kingdom used Middle Egyptian, and Middle Egyptian was kind of the classical phase of the ancient Egyptian language. So it's an interesting period anyway. And in the midst of this, in what's called the 12th dynasty, about 1880 BC, there's this king that you see here, known as Senwosret, or Sesostris is the Greek version of his name, Sesostris or Senwosret III. He's just one of a number of kings of this period, and for some reason, this king, who was very wealthy and powerful in this kind of period of the Middle Kingdom, which was a high point of wealth and prosperity in Egypt, he decides he wants to build a tomb at Abydos. He actually already had a pyramid up in the north near Memphis, but down at the base of this Anubis Mountain, he built this monstrous tomb, which is one of the biggest in Egypt. You can see it on this plan here. It's inside of this huge enclosure of brick that runs up against the base of the cliffs, the mountain that I showed you, the Mountain of Anubis. And this thing here is the tomb. It's cut down into the low desert. This is the entrance to it, or the location to the entrance to it. And then it's cut in the bedrock, extending over about 800 feet beneath the mountain itself. So it's one of the biggest royal tombs ever built in Egypt. And connected with this he established a temple and also a large town. So you see, connected with the tomb site down at the edge of the Nile floodplain or the cultivation, there's a mortuary temple that was established to maintain the cult of Senwosret III after he died and was buried. He didn't want to be forgotten. This was one of the major concerns of the Egyptians, was being remembered and venerated and having your spirit offered to for eternity. So there's what's called a mortuary or funerary temple that's established. And then there to the right, what's called the town of Ouaghsout. There was a planned town, a state-built town created to house the people who maintained the cult of the king in the temple, and the king himself presumably buried in the tomb at the foot of Anubis Mountain. So this is what I've been working on for a couple decades now. It's a great sort of laboratory of archaeology of the Middle Kingdom period, because we have what began to develop after Senwosret III as a growing royal necropolis. As George mentioned, we have actually now not just Senwosret III's tomb here, which is the biggest one, we have 13 other royal tombs that were added in succeeding centuries. This Anubis Mountain became sort of a place of interest to succeeding kings, so they came and added their tombs in the vicinity. So the royal necropolis, the temple, looking at the structure and the functions of the royal temple, and then also the urban site, the settlement, and how it was designed and functioned over several centuries. So whether you're interested in sort of economics and the functions of settlements and kind of more social issues, or the royal necropolis and the design of royal tombs, there's a whole bunch of stuff here to keep us interested. The whole place had a very long ancient name in Egyptian there. The seal that you see there, this shield-shaped stamp in the line drawing there. This is the actual ancient name for the place as a whole. It was called in Egyptian Ouaghsout Chakara Ma'acheru Emabju, which translates into English as enduring are the places of Chakare. Chakare is one of the names of King Senwosret III. So enduring are the places of Senwosret III, true of voice in Abydos. And the whole kind of place as it developed over time was known in this form. So let's turn to look at what's really been a very fun thing to work on over the last really 2 decades as it's been unfolding. This royal necropolis has been sort of a gift that has just kept on giving. So when I went back to this site after we applied for permission from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to begin work here, one of the things that we were very interested in was returning to this monstrous tomb of King Senwosret III. It had actually been opened a century ago, very briefly, by a number of British excavators connected with what's called the Egypt Exploration Fund, a British organization. They found the tomb, they opened it, they recorded it. There were a couple photographs and some very kind of schematic drawings of it, but it hadn't been systematically investigated. And so there were a lot of questions about it. And so one of the agendas we've had was to reopen the tomb, which took us about 5 months of digging through sand to find the entrance. It's very deeply buried in the sandy landscape. And then systematically excavating the roughly 800-foot long structure, which goes beneath the mountain itself. So this has taken a long period of time. It's been very fun to do. We're almost done with it, but there's some nooks and crannies still inside the tomb. It has lots of different parts. And as you get deeper into the inner recesses of it, there are parts we're not quite sure we entirely understand what's going on still. But we've been excavating there for a number of years. It's a huge operation to dig this far down beneath the mountain. We usually need at least 100 men to operate the ramps and the system of removing stuff. It's quite fun to do this. There's some of the guys having they always have fun when we work in the giant tomb. They always ask, are we going to work in the big tomb this year? And I'm usually like, well, we're going to wait till next year to continue. But there they are, pretending to be the guardians of the tomb. So it's been like a long, systematic kind of process of excavation. The tomb, when we opened it, we reopened it back in 2005. After a century of being inaccessible, we reopened it, and it was entirely clogged. All of the chambers, all of the passages were essentially full to the ceiling level with debris, like what you see here. You could worm your way in like a snake, basically right below the ceiling. And I had a number of people who had claustrophobia that said, "Oh, I'll go in and take a look." And they got halfway into the tomb and they were like, I got to get out of here. And made their way for the exit very quickly. But we've systematically excavated it with a lot of effort, removing the debris, a lot of the wreckage of ancient tomb robbers who did a lot of damage to the tomb. And there you see some of the beautiful architecture that's come out. This is a magnificent tomb that shows, it's an example of a type of tomb that we see coming into Egypt in the Middle Kingdom where there's intensive kind of investment, architectural investment in the idea of concealing and protecting the royal burial place. They put huge effort into blocking systems. On the right there, for instance, you see a 50-ton fallen blocking stone of granite, which is one of just a whole series of I think a total of about 300 tons of granite blocking stones that filled an ancient passageway that went down to the burial compartments of the king. Ancient tomb robbers dislodged that block that you see there, which fell into the chamber where it still sits today. This is just one part of a very elaborate system of blocking and concealing and trying to predict how tomb robbers may kind of puncture in and try to find the treasure and the body of the king and defile it. So they just put this kind of incredible effort and investment of resources into the design and creation of this kind of a tomb. In every case, including this tomb at Anubis Mountain, we have a number of other tombs that have kind of similar concepts. They failed utterly. The tomb robbers that came a century or two later, whenever they came, when political troubles, the decline of the Middle Kingdom happened at a certain point, political troubles start up. There was a lure to a place like this, a royal necropolis. People remembered what was there, and so tomb robbers would come, and at a certain point, they had the ability. They were protected by corrupt local officials. There were large gangs of them, and they began to dig around, and they actually penetrated this tomb and other ones. So the massive blocking system, like what you see there, did not protect the burial of Senwosret III, and thousands of years ago, it was destroyed. It was plundered. But for us, it's incredibly interesting because this is an example of a certain phase of Egyptian funerary religion where kings were building tombs of a certain type. The architecture speaks to us in religious terms of Egyptian ideas of what was important to the king when he died. As we understand it, the architecture of this tomb, it's roughly 800-foot sequence of chambers and passages, is not just a tomb designed to protect a burial chamber, but the sequence is actually symbolic. And the materials they used, the different design of the chambers and the sequence of them is mimicking religious ideas of the notion of the solar passage, the daily cycle of the sun, as the sun rises and passes over and sets into the west. The Egyptians had an understanding of what happened while the sun god journeyed under the earth. And they had this term for what they thought happened. It was called the Amduat. What is in the netherworld, or what is in the 12 hours of the night, the dark solar passage that the sun god goes through. And this tomb, we believe, is actually a sort of a simulation in architecture of that solar passage during the night hours. And if the king associates with the sun in that nocturnal passage, he too will be reborn at dawn. So he'll have eternal life like the sun. So it's a symbolic tomb, but also they were able to merge into these protective devices. So the tomb has been keeping us busy for a long period of time. It's, as I mentioned, it's one of the largest tombs in Egypt. There you see one of the chambers I showed you. We've actually excavated and cleaned out most of the spaces at this point, with the exception of some of the internal parts. But what's become of great interest over the last decade increasingly at Anubis Mountain is what happened after this kind of anchoring tomb of King Senwosret III was built there because over the next 2 centuries, so King Senwosret III reigned about 1850 BC. A century later, about 1750 BC, there's a series of other powerful Middle Kingdom pharaohs in the 13th dynasty that added their tombs. And then another century beyond that, so 2 centuries after Senwosret III, in what's called the Second Intermediate Period, where Egypt enters a phase of kind of conflict and territorial fragmentation. Egypt actually broke apart into a series of rival kingdoms. There were kings in that period that were drawn to this place and they added their tombs. And so one of these is one that I'm going to focus on a little bit, the tomb of King Seneb-Kay. Seneb-Kay we discovered 10 years ago, 2014. We found his tomb. There you see it. It's a beautiful, the burial chamber of it's beautifully decorated with painted images of goddesses and inscriptions and the name of the king. It is the exact opposite of the tomb of Senwosret III. Seneb-Kay's tomb is a tiny little tomb. I think it might officially be the smallest king's tomb in all of Egypt that's ever been discovered. And I always remember my wife Jen's comment when we found the tomb of Seneb-Kay, and she stood there and looked at it. She said, "Joe, I think you just found the cutest little pharaoh's tomb ever." So yeah, I often remember those words. There you see it. That tomb is the successor to these other kings that came along. So before Seneb-Kay, we have a series of other powerful kings that are still in kind of the heyday of the Middle Kingdom. 2 of them were brothers. There's a series of brother kings, 2 of whom we now know were buried at Abydos as well in the necropolis of Anubis Mountain. One of them is a king called Neferhotep I. He was succeeded by his brother called Sobek-Hotep IV. A lot of these kings had similar names. Actually, in the 13th dynasty, there were 7 different kings called Sobek-Hotep. It was a very popular name. So we have Sobek-Hotep IV, the brother of Neferhotep I, who was buried there. Here you see this tomb. This is another very large, grand tomb. You see these big blocking stones. This is the burial chamber, which has a massive lid and a blocking stone. Huge investment in the techniques to protect and conceal and prevent tomb robbery into these massive royal burial places. Again, they all failed. So we've been working on these successor tombs of the 13th dynasty. This is the one you just saw was Neferhotep I. This is the tomb of Sobek-Hotep IV. There again, you see the size of these huge stone elements, all of which are conceived to protect the burial place of the king. And some of these, what's always interesting in royal cemeteries in Egypt, one of the realities of life in ancient Egypt, and even for kings, is that, lifespan is unpredictable. Especially in this particular period, there were many, many kings that have very, very short reigns. In fact, in the 13th dynasty, I think the average reign length was only about 3.5 years. So there were many kings that were coming and going, and we're not quite sure exactly how the political system was working with these rapid turnover of kings, but some of them were very stable. And these 2 kings, Neferhotep I and Sobek-Hotep IV, they ruled for like 10 and 12 years apiece. But there was actually another tomb that we found near their tombs, which is a great example of an unfinished or abandoned tomb. You find this throughout royal necropoli in Egypt, where a king starts a tomb and then he dies, and they just don't have the will or the time required to complete the tomb. A number of years ago, we found this huge crypt in the desert. It's 60 tons, you can see, of red quartzite. You can see it's been carved into a burial chamber. It has a recess for the coffin of the king, and what's called the canopic recess, where the canopic box that contained the inner organs that were mummified would be placed. And so this was intended to be lowered down into the lowest recesses of a tomb, would then be fitted with all of the things that you saw in the other tombs, Neferhotep I and Sobek-Hotep IV. But this one was abandoned. It was just sitting in the desert, and we found it a number of years ago. It was a very exciting find. So this abandoned royal crypt. And aside from documenting it when we found it, what does one do with a giant hunk of stone in the desert? It was the middle of the summer. We joked about filling with water, and we thought it would be a nice swimming pool or cooling location. This was, I think, taken in July. So it was that 110 degree temperature that I mentioned earlier. We decided we weren't going to fill it with water. The antiquities inspector probably would not have been too pleased if we had tried to do that. But we decided, let's try to see how many people can fit in an abandoned royal burial chamber of the Middle Kingdom. So a lot of the workers that were involved and some of the team, we all squeezed inside of it. So we had some fun in the process of excavating and documenting that. So those are these 13th dynasty tombs. Now moving forward, again, 2 centuries after Senwosret III established Anubis Mountain with his monster tomb, Egypt is in the throes of political decline. Egypt in the period of what we call today we call the Second Intermediate Period. It's often also called the Hyksos period, when Egypt was broken apart. The delta that I mentioned of Lower Egypt was ruled over by a kingdom called the Hyksos. Upper Egypt, the valley to the south, was divided into a series of rival kingdoms. And it's been very debated exactly kind of what the political history of this complex, turbulent period, the Second Intermediate Period, how it actually develops. There's still a lot of uncertainty about it. But lo and behold, 10 years ago, we were very fortunate in investigations at Anubis Mountain to come upon a series of tombs from this Second Intermediate Period, or Hyksos period. And one of the very exciting finds was the discovery of this tomb, the tomb of this King Seneb-Kay in 2014. When we discovered it, as usually happens in excavations in the desert, it's not too much to look at to start with. There's one of our what are called the guftis, the trained foremen of the excavators, cleaning down a series of mud bricks. You can see very simple looking rows of mud bricks that turned out to be part of an entrance ramp. So what you see there is actually this ramp that leads down to a stone doorway that takes you down into the actual tomb. So in 2014, we came upon this entrance to this tomb. We had no idea what we were looking at the time. My wife Jen took this photo of me at that moment in time where we'd cleaned down this entrance passage, and we saw that there was a broken stone kind of sliding doorway that leads into the rest of the tomb. We hadn't excavated the rest of the tomb at that point. And she asked me at the time, because she knew what my response would be, and some of you may be familiar with the famous quote from 1922 when Howard Carter when they broke through into the tomb of King Tut, and he was asked the question, "What do you see?" And of course, the only response an Egyptologist can give is "wonderful things." So that's the famous quote from the discovery of the tomb of King Tut. So she asked me that question, and I looked at her and said, "Wonderful things." But all I was looking at was sand, because you can see it's just a broken doorway just full of sand. So, but what turned out to be the case is it was actually full of wonderful things, because it turned out to be the tomb of a man who had entirely been unidentified, unrecorded in Egyptian history up to this point, a lost pharaoh. So the discovery of Seneb-Kay's tomb took us into the investigation of this magnificent, decorated but tiny tomb that gives us a new identity, an identification of this king called Seneb-Kay, who reigned about 1650 BC. We excavated the tomb in detail, recorded the decorated walls that you see there. It was a very fun process. Very quickly, we got a fair bit of press. There's the Philadelphia Inquirer article, Finders of a Lost Pharaoh. So it attracted quite a lot of press. Here you see the process of excavating it. We were very excited when we found the painted decoration, because Egyptians did not always decorate the walls of royal tombs, but in this case, they painted the walls of this small burial chamber and recorded the name of the occupant, the king who was buried there. And there you see the very small but beautifully decorated burial chamber of Seneb-Kay, and just some details of the imagery. There's what's called the gnomon, the cartouche, or the oval that contains one of the names of the king. That's his name, Seneb-Kay. He has other names as well. But that immediately gave us the identity of the king. We had no idea who he was. We began to try to fit him into the history, because his name did not appear in any of the the known records of ancient Egypt, and we were rapidly able to kind of fit him into kind of the general picture, though, of Egyptian history. And there's the cartouche, again, of Seneb-Kay. So he was reintroduced to the world in 2014. I was very excited that within like a week of the announcement, or maybe it was like the day after the Egyptian Antiquities, the Ministry of Antiquities announced the discovery of the tomb of Seneb-Kay, he had a Wikipedia page. It like instantly appeared. I didn't have anything to do with it, but someone wrote this, opened a Wikipedia page, and some of the facts were wrong, but most of it was okay. So, he went from being this unknown figure to suddenly having a Wikipedia page and images of his tomb spread out across the world, the internet, of course, helping dramatically. Of course, when things are on the internet, they attract the interests of a whole variety of people. And it wouldn't have occurred to me kind of some of the things that might be said about Seneb-Kay that were made on the basis of the images of the decoration in his tomb and his skeleton that I'll show you in a second. But this one, back from right after the discovery, where images of the burial chamber had been publicized, it says, as previously reported on before its news, the tomb of a forgotten pharaoh has been found in Egypt. Interestingly, the painted scene below of the goddesses Neith and Nut protecting the canopic shrine of the pharaoh Osir-Ebre Seneb-Kay has led once again to discussion of Nibiru and the Anunnaki for obvious telltale reasons. So I don't know what's obvious about that. They explain further, with obvious symbolism of Nibiru, the Anunnaki, and reptilians, in the painting above and the paintings and info in the videos below, have we been presented with more proof of an otherworldly civilization long before ours, with origins that go far beyond our planet Earth? So people are out there making other interpretations of who Seneb-Kay was. And I think what they identify as the reptilian may be what's called the winged sun disk that you see in the image there. It's the sun disk with the wings, and there's two, what we call the rearing cobra, called the uraeus, that flank the disk. I think they saw the cobras, and somehow this is connected with the Anunnaki or extraterrestrial reptilians. So anyway, there's nothing to do with reptilians in the tomb. I was not at all impressed by that. The only thing reptilian about the tomb, and we do worry about this working in the desert, is that a lot of these tombs, when you open them and you're out in the very edge of the desert, one of the things that's out there are vipers. And when you open a hole in the desert, you get these creatures that slither across the desert, and they get stuck down in tombs like this. And a number of cases when we were working on the tomb of Seneb-Kay, we came in the morning to find these giant vipers in there. So here's one of them that was dispatched. This was one of our inspectors. He was very impressed. He said this was the biggest viper he had ever seen. So those are the reptilians that we worry about, not the extraterrestrial ones. When we discovered the tomb of Seneb-Kay, in addition to the tomb, the other thing that was like a gold mine of information was that even though the tomb had been plundered by tomb robbers in ancient times, they had taken all the valuables. They had stripped the king's burial of the gold and the sarcophagus. There were a series of nested coffins that were, well, at least one of which would have been gilded. They took the gold, whatever other valuables, and they threw the body of the king into one of the outer chambers. And so we actually retrieved the bulk of the skeleton of Seneb-Kay. This has given us a great window into the time, the era when Seneb-Kay ruled, in this kind of turbulent era of the Second Intermediate Period. So also when the press release on Seneb-Kay went out, they showed an image of his skeleton that had been retrieved from the excavations. This also attracted the wisdom of the internet. So I kind of like this one. A bunch of people saw the photo and they commented on the skeleton, as you see there. So someone named Wally Gator said, anyone else wonder why in the second last pic, the left index finger looks so long? So I guess this attracted, I would have never guessed that would attract their interest. And someone called C'est Moi chimes in, well, there are bones missing from the other fingers. Wally Gator then says, okay, thanks, you're right. And it looks to be the same case for the left foot also. C'est Moi then says, it was either that or confirmation of alien influence in pyramid building. So again, the aliens, in Egyptology, aliens always come up. It's not really clear why. Then this other part of the brain trust here weighs in. The owner was a proctologist in life, ? And he kicked with his left. Soccer might be older than previously thought. So anyway, there was a lot of fun at the time of the discovery of Seneb-Kay's tomb. So he was not a proctologist. It's not information on the early development of soccer. What Seneb-Kay's skeleton does tell us, though, is it gives us a window into what really was a tremendously problematic, kind of politically turbulent period of a lot of conflict in Egypt. One of the things we know from Seneb-Kay's skeleton is that he died in the midst of battle. His body is covered in more than 20 traumatic wounds that cut to the bone from the top of his head to his feet. So there may have been many more that aren't preserved, but these are ones that we can identify in the bone structure. So these are piercing wounds, a number of really major ones. For example, we'll look at his cranium in just a second. There's a series of impressions of battle axe wounds to the top of his cranium, but also his lower body. His knees and his legs were very badly attacked. And in fact, at one point in the military event that he's involved in, they severed his right foot. His foot would have been just like dangling, essentially. He seems to have defended himself at some point because there are cuts to his hand, but also all on the inner parts of the hands, as if he's trying to kind of ward off blows and was being cut. Attacks to his knees and pelvis. Patterns of wounds that led to his death. They're very striking in the volume, and they really speak to the very kind of traumatic way in which he died. Most telling are the impressions of battle axes. So this is his cranium, and this wound labeled A is very dramatic. It's very clear. You can see the curvature of it there. It actually preserves entirely the impression of a battle axe of this time period. You can see the curvature and the shape, actually, of the battle axe. We can reconstruct what the weapon looked like based on the impression in his skull. So he died in the midst of battle. He's a king who was fighting someone. The analysis of his skeleton has led us to suggest that he may have been on horseback. This is a period of Egypt where the horse is coming into Egypt and beginning to be adapted in military activities. He may have been mounted on horseback, and some of the patterns of the wounds suggest they may have been oriented to dislodging him from his horse, and then he fell to the ground and is kind of dispatched in the final moment. So these are kind of stages that we've reconstructed based on the patterns of the wounds. So it really kind of, it opens a window of understanding into the intense kind of political discord of this second intermediate period. Seneb-Kay seems to have been a king who was part of a kind of a struggling kingdom. We call it the Abydos dynasty. He's one of a group of kings, some other ones that were also buried at Abydos in the Anubis Mountain necropolis. I'll show you their tombs in just a second. They seem to have been part of a kind of a kingdom in this southern part of what's called Middle Egypt, to the north of the region of Thebes, making use of Abydos as their burial ground, and probably vying for power with other regional kingdoms. So I like to describe it as a period of sort of warring states where Egypt is broken apart, they're fighting for territory, and Seneb-Kay is one of the victims, in a sense, of this political discord. So anyway, it was a great kind of exciting discovery, and the results were published in this volume, King Seneb-Kay's Tomb and the Necropolis of a Lost Dynasty at Abydos. Seneb-Kay was an unidentified king. He became now part of the history of Egypt, but also the dynasty to which he belongs. can now be cemented as part of the political history of Egypt. So we published it in that volume that you see there from the Penn Museum. There's also, if you're interested, a sort of cheesy documentary adaptation on, you can find it on YouTube. It was a series called Secrets. Series 7, Part 6 was called Murdered Pharaoh. And they have some of those wonderful creations of the pharaoh in his bedchamber being attacked. They erroneously, as you can see from the title, they called him the murdered pharaoh. He wasn't murdered, he died in the midst of battle. But they raised the possibility that maybe he was just assassinated in his bedchamber, which is, I think, not the case. But anyway, that's like the Cliff Notes version. If you want the full story, you can read the book there. Otherwise, the Secrets one is kind of interesting. So anyway, Seneb-Kay is, he's one of our very exciting discoveries, but there's a whole series of these now. As George mentioned, we have, in addition to these, to Senwosret III and Neferhotep I and Sobek-Hotep IV and Seneb-Kay, there's a series of other tombs. Unfortunately, not all of these kings are known by name. Some of these tombs are very grand, much larger than Seneb-Kay's. This is an example of one of them. So around Seneb-Kay's tomb, there's a whole developed necropolis of this second intermediate period. So kings probably before and after him. We're not quite sure on the sequence exactly. Just one of these tombs, but with stone burial chambers, originally richly equipped with royal funerary offerings, all of them plundered in ancient times by tomb robbers. One of the things we discover in excavating a site like this is, I mean, we really come to appreciate the tenacity of ancient tomb robbers in finding the gold and plundering the royal tombs. So anyway, there's a detail of it. There's Seneb-Kay's tomb, the main group of second intermediate period or Abydos dynasty tombs. Now, fast forward to just this last January, we've been doing work in the same area in succeeding seasons, and I'd actually come to the conclusion that, well, maybe we had found everything there was to do with the age of Seneb-Kay and these other kings of the second intermediate period. We were working on parts of the greater enclosure of this tomb of this King Neferhotep I, who I mentioned. And lo and behold, suddenly, out of the sand, there popped up another tomb, a much larger tomb than any of the other ones. This one is, as you can see, it was added or built very close to the earlier tomb of King Neferhotep I, but it's from the same time period as King Seneb-Kay. So these are the excavations of the Neferhotep I area. Just to give you a little sense of the excavations in a site like this, a lot of it is very time-consuming, and it just takes a lot of effort to make your way through vast accumulations of wind-blown sand because it's up at the base of the cliffs of the desert. In many cases, there's 5 meters, 8 meters of sand that you have to dig down to find the architecture. So it takes a fair bit of patience, but eventually one does get down to what's of interest. There you just see the excavations. And next to the tomb of Neferhotep I, in this area we came upon yet another royal tomb. We had no idea it was going to be there. And this is the one that we discovered this last January, which is a beautiful tomb, a huge kind of stone-built burial chamber with brick parts. You can see this view shows the burial chamber looking out towards the brick entrance shaft. Here's another view looking into the burial chamber. A very exciting discovery. At the point where we were entering the burial chamber, excavating down from above, I had great hope of finding objects that would provide, like Seneb-Kay, the name of the king. And lo and behold, as we dug down and found the entrance to the tomb, I was very excited to see what is maybe a little hard to make out, but painted images. You can see the feet of a goddess here, and on the other side, the feet of another goddess. They're looking in towards the doorway that takes you into the king's burial chamber. These are figures that are very similar to the ones that decorated Seneb-Kay's stone burial chamber. But they were added not to the stone parts of the tomb, but to the brick, the plastered brick parts of the tomb. And so tomb robbers that damaged this tomb in later periods when it was robbed, the upper parts of the brick structure are kind of badly denuded. And down here in front of these goddesses are the remains of texts that would have had the name of the king. And we were very, very upset in the final results of excavating this tomb to realize that if there had just been maybe a few more inches of preservation, the texts that we can see were there would have given us the name of the king, but they just didn't survive. So this is a tomb of the same period. There you can see the decoration, one of the goddesses. We date it to the same time as the Abydos dynasty. It's part of this whole group of kings. Just another view of it. So we're still working in the area of this most recent discovery. We hope to identify through various ways. There may yet be objects that we identify in the debris around this tomb. We're still working in here to try and identify the owner of this tomb. How do you identify a king whose name is not preserved? Well, one thing we have recourse to in Egyptian archaeology is there are texts and inscriptions in some cases, and so we have a number of persons of interest. These are minor kings of the period who are very likely ones who should have been buried in the Anubis Mountain necropolis. There's a man called Senayib, a man named Payan Cheni, and a king called Wepwaut Emsaf. These are all kings. We have like one stela from them. We know they lived. We know they were active at Abydos, but we don't know where their tombs were. So these may be the kind of figures that would have owned the tomb.
For about 10 more minutes. So.
Okay, yeah, I have like two or three more slides. So yeah, I know I've gone a little bit over. So yeah, that brings me to the end of, yeah. So anyway, so it's an ongoing discovery. As I mentioned, the excavations of Anubis Mountain it's given us a lot of surprises. You can never, in archaeology, like any scientific discipline, you try to make predictions and you come up with a research plan and try to prove hypotheses. But it's also sort of just the luck of the draw. It's sort of the gamble of what you find there. And in many cases, we're just entirely surprised by what pops out of the sand. So we're hoping for more evidence about these kings that added their tombs to Anubis Mountain. And let me see, I just had a few slides to round up just a sense of the excavations at South Abydos. So alongside the royal necropolis, we've got a bunch of other parts of the site that are quite interesting. So as I mentioned, it's not just a series of royal tombs, but we have this town of the people that maintained the cult of Senwosret III and probably other kings in the nearby temple. You see the ruins of a series of large mud brick buildings. You can see the layout of this town. We've been investigating this over a number of years at the same time. It gives us an insight into society of the Middle Kingdom period and the Second Intermediate period. Here you see a reconstruction of some of the buildings in this town. One of them is what we call Building A, which is this sort of palatial-sized complex, which was the house of the mayor of the town. A series of mayors over about 2 centuries lived in this building. And I think I'm almost at the end there. But talking about the unpredictability of work in Egypt and at Anubis Mountain, one of the other things we found, a very exciting thing for an archaeologist working in the desert, you don't often think that you're going to come across, working in the sands out in the Sahara Desert, basically, to come upon boats or watercraft. Lo and behold, one of the things the Egyptians loved to do when they buried kings was to bury boats out in the desert so the spirit of the king could journey into the afterlife and associate with the sun god. A number of years ago, we discovered, not far from the tombs I just showed you, this huge sort of underground chamber, a vaulted burial containing the remnants of a boat. And interestingly, in front of the entrance to it, about 120, I think, jars that were turned upside down. They poured liquid out in front of this boat building, and then you see this weird assemblage of these upside down jars. There may have been some ritual meant to pour water into the sands of the desert to float the boat into the afterlife to assist with the spirit of the king in his netherworld journey. So that was a very exciting discovery. And I guess I'll just finish here, though. It also gave me the chance to do something that I'm pretty sure I will never, ever do again, but one of the signature journals for archaeologists who work on Maritime and Nautical Archaeology is the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology. And so I was suddenly had the opportunity to publish in this journal, IJNA. So the royal boat burial and watercraft tableau, these scenes of water, images of boats that decorated the boat building. I will never, ever contribute to this journal again, I'm pretty certain, but it was fun to do so. Anyway, so that's the end of the talk. Excavating in Egypt is incredibly fun. It's an international endeavor, working with the Egyptian government and local Egyptians. We're working on opening these tombs for visitors and restoring them. You see some of the conservation work. And ultimately, well, a number of them are now open to visitors who come to the site. Seneb-Kay's tomb is accessible to people who want to see it. And we're putting the resources into not just excavating and documenting and then reburying them, but to making it a place that visitors that come to Egypt can see the tombs of this period at Anubis Mountain. All right, so I've gone too long, but thank you for your attention. And if there's time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Do you ever use ground penetrating radar, sonar?
Yeah, an excellent question. Yeah, so when you're working in a very, kind of nondescript landscape like this, I mean, the beige sands of the desert are pretty all-concealing. There's various remote sensing techniques that are valuable. We tried ground penetrating radar. It's a very difficult, touchy technique to use. I think you can get results from it in the right context. We didn't really have any meaningful results when we tried it. The technique that's really valuable in Egypt and pretty consistently you find good evidence for is magnetometry. A device that essentially detects a magnetic signature, but the desert surface, and you can lay out a grid and map it physically. And a number of the tombs that we excavated, these Abydos dynasty tombs, we found using magnetometry. The problem with it in a site like this is it typically only goes like about 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters if the walls are very thick. So anything that's deeper, you just don't see it. So then it's just a matter of physically digging down and seeing what's there. But yeah, remote sensing is very, very important. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what do the Egyptians think about you bringing all of these artifacts back to Philadelphia?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We don't actually bring objects back anymore. So I've been talking about Abydos. When Abydos started up in the 1960s, the University of Pennsylvania excavations there was still what's called the Division of Finds with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. And some of the latest material that came to Philadelphia is from division material that came up through 1981, which was, I think, the last year of the divisions of finds. So what would happen is basically the Egyptian Antiquities Organization or ministry would decide, okay, there's a set of stuff that's been excavated, we want this. And so they chose what they wanted. And the rest of it, they said, you can take this if you want. And so there would be an assemblage of material that would go back to the sponsoring institutions. It went on for over 100 years, this division of finds. Many museums were built around this principle. So it ended in 1981, and yeah, we just, all of the objects we excavate remain there. We have storage facilities built into our dig house. Most of the objects remain there. Anything that's particularly special or valuable might go to a museum. We have a few objects in one local museum has a couple objects from our excavations here. Or it could even end up in the Cairo Museum or the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is opening in just a couple days, in case you're not aware. But yeah, it all just stays in Egypt. And so we study it there, we document it there, we don't bring it back anymore. Yep.
So I'm curious how, there's so many kings, how did you get to be a king, other than I understand by lineage once there is one, but
yeah,
how does that take place?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. In most periods, most of the kind of stable dynasties of Egypt, it's essentially a familial succession, father to son succession, ideally. It can happen in many ways. Sometimes it's not, it's not always the eldest son that takes the throne after his father, but sometimes sons predecease their fathers. And so, for example, there's a famous case of Ramses II, who ruled for 67 years. His first 12 sons died before he did. So the king that eventually took the throne, King Merentau, was the 13th son. So yeah, there's all kinds of weird stuff that happens. We do have instances of female pharaohs in a couple cases, mostly in periods of kind of some kind of political issues or succession issues in the royal house. In this period that I mentioned where the 13th dynasty, we have this kind of rapid turnover of kings. We don't actually fully understand how it happens. The dynasty, we call it a dynasty, but it's actually groups of mostly unassociated kings. Maybe one or two in succession will be related within the same family, and then a totally different family takes control. We're trying to, this is one of the reasons we're interested in this site, is trying to understand changes in the kingship and the royal succession. We think there may have been some kind of a system of circulating kingship where the rich and powerful families of Egypt somehow selected a king who rules for a short period, and then a new family takes the throne. But it's very unclear. We don't have extremely clear evidence on how it happened or how they identified the successor. I hope that sort of answers it a bit. Yes?
How do you date the tombs? How did they feed themselves? Growing crops along the floodplain? Mm-hmm. Where did they get the dyes for the paintings on the wall?
Yeah.
Is some of your funding coming from the federal government? And have you seen a decline in that present situation?
Yeah. Right now we don't have any federal funds, and we're relying on sort of endowment and private funding for most of this work. In the work at Anubis Mountain, we have got a lot of money over the years. We have an organization called the American Research Center in Egypt that has a branch of it called the Antiquities Endowment Fund that was established years ago with assistance from USAID. But once they had established it, it kind of established as a separate endowment. And so it was at the point that USAID was closed, they weren't dependent on it anymore. So that fortunately that's not reliant on federal funding, and we're hoping to use the American Research Center funding going forward as well. Your other questions, you had a series of them. Dating the tombs. There's a variety of techniques. For the most part in Egyptian archaeology, the historical dating sequence, which is established through kind of a backbone of king lists and lists of the order of kings and dynasties and the lengths of their reigns, of which there's various kind of models. So there's different alternative versions, but in general, it's pretty accurate. So for the later history of Egypt, kings' reigns can be dated quite precisely. And when you get back to like the Middle Kingdom, there's different kind of possible dating options. So there's a little bit of leeway. We have what's called the high, middle, and the low chronology. And depending on which one you ascribe to, you might assign different dates. But it's mostly through historical sources. And those have been anchored into absolute chronology through astronomical dating techniques. So we have, in ancient Egypt, various astronomical observations, for instance, of the rising, what's called the heliacal rising of Sirius or Sothis, the dog star, which happened at a certain time and can be used to calibrate the chronology. There were priests that recorded when it occurred in certain years of a king's reign. So we have papyri that talk about that. So, but there's all kinds of complications. Historical dating is very significant for us. In archaeological sites, scientific dating techniques like carbon dating are increasingly important. And carbon dating, when it first developed, was not super useful for most of Egyptian history because the historical dating was kind of more accurate than just because the range of uncertainty in the carbon dating. But improvements to carbon dating have made it more and more significant, especially for the early periods of Egypt. People are relying more and more on carbon dating. So as you go back into the, like 3000 BC, for instance, there's a lot of leeway in the historical dates. So carbon dates will be significant. And there's other scientific dating techniques as well.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Wegner. This was fascinating.
Sure, my pleasure.
And I'm pleased to share that Dr. Jen Wegner has accepted my invitation for a future Schemel, so we'll have another series of presentations on Egypt as well, either the spring or the fall. We'll sort of work that out later. But thanks, everyone. Have a great day.